Welcome to Washington in Focus, your source for the week's top stories in the state of Washington. I'm Cole Lauterbach, managing editor for the Center Square Newswire service. This week, we'll discuss the first debate between Washington's candidates for governor, the state pledging to address chronic absenteeism in schools, Seattle shifting its proposed prostitution enforcement to target the pimps of the city, and new allegations that a state university could have broken a law in trying to access 911 information. That's ahead on Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach.
Some people would call him a loser. He ran for state office. He was beaten. He started a business. He failed. He ran for Congress. He lost. He was nominated for vice president. He lost again. But he knew only those who never tried are the real losers. And Abraham Lincoln was no loser. Persistence. Pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life at values.com.
Welcome back to Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach. Now, let's jump into the headlines. With Governor Jay Inslee not seeking office, underdog Republicans in Washington are as close to getting one of their own into the governor's office than they have been in decades. Centrist Republican Dave Reichert is facing Democratic Attorney General Bob Ferguson. The duo faced off in their first debate this week. Capitol correspondent Carlene Johnson covered the event. It seemed to get a little rowdy, didn't it, Carlene?
Yeah, right from the jump, to borrow a phrase from my teenager. I was within the first 7 minutes of the debate. Reichert, the Republican candidate, announced he's not supporting the GOP nor Democratic presidential nominees. And so Ferguson jumped in and right away says, wait a minute, you're supporting the convicted felon and convicted sexual abuser. And that's when he's like, no, sorry to disappoint you, Bob, but I'm not supporting Trump. And I'm also not supporting Harris. And that seemed to come as a surprise to a lot of folks on social media right away. I was kind of monitoring. I was watching the debate and taking some notes and then monitoring real-time social media. And a lot of supporters of Reichert didn't seem very pleased that he, came out publicly and said that Trump wouldn't be getting his vote.
Well, but I mean, and there's the devil's in the details there, because he has said he would vote for Trump in the past, but he's not endorsing him. He's not, right, stumping for him. He's not going to stand on a stage in Spokane with the president, if the president ever got the bad idea to try and campaign there. But, at the same time, Ferguson, politically, it behooves him to tie Reichert to Trump, because what that does is, well, they believe it moves the needle for centrist Republicans, of which many, you look at Trump's previous vote tallies where there are Republicans who will vote Republican all the way down the ballot, but leave the top ticket option empty. I know that in some states you were looking at tens of thousands of people that did that. And that's where Reichert kind of finds himself. But Ferguson, I mean, it was his objective. It seemed like number one objective from the get-go to try and make sure that Trump was hanging around Reichert's neck.
Yeah, and I didn't do the count on, how many times he said Trump in the debate, but it was more than a dozen. It
seemed like a lot.
Yes. Yeah. And he kept, even after Reichert said, I'm not going to vote for Trump and I'm not going to vote for Harris. Then Ferguson pushed back and he's like, I remember you spoke to this group of Republican activists. You said you're supporting Donald Trump. And he was making reference to something that some of our readers might recall was major headlines back in spring when Reichert was at a Republican activist event and he was asked outright, are you going to vote for Trump? And he did not answer audibly, but he nodded his head apparently. And there was a Democratic operative, Ferguson plant maybe, in the event who reported on that. So that got a lot of play and Ferguson kept bringing that back up.
Right. Well, and they did. I mean, it wasn't just a cult of personality debate. I mean, to both of their credit, Ferguson and Reichert both leaned heavily into, I would say, policy issues. And Reichert has a track record. I mean, he was a member of Congress, correct? But Ferguson spent years as the state's top attorney, the Attorney General. and a lot of other state attorney generals have taken measures to say, we're cracking down on the opioid crisis. We are, working on it, like say in California with organized retail theft. There's been a lot of changes and prosecutions for that. County attorneys have done the same thing. One of the things that I noticed was Reichert really leaned hard into Ferguson's previous support for the decriminalization of drugs in general.
Yeah. And when the moderators, asked about homelessness and the drug epidemic, which are, most of us know are intertwined, Reichert fired back and he said, basically the homeless problem is not just a problem, a housing issue. Yes, affordable housing is all part of it. Mental illness is part of it, but it really truly stems, Reichert said, from a drug and substance abuse crisis. And back in 2021, you may recall that was shortly after the Supreme Court's Blake decision that basically decriminalized drug possession and set Washington, down the drug spiral we've been on. At the time, Ferguson came out in support of decriminalization. He said, this should not be an issue for people that have drug problems. They shouldn't be in the criminal justice system. It's a public health issue. So, he's got that burden to bear because we're all at this spot now where we know what basically the legalization of hard drugs in Washington has done to us, on some level.
And you alluded to it, but, homelessness, it can't be understated enough where a lot of other states, homelessness is not polling as the top issue in Iowa, right?
Right.
Because, even homeless people don't want to live there. But in terms of, in places like Washington, Western Washington especially, the homelessness crisis, Oregon, California, Arizona, in the West is often the very top concern because it leads to all of these other problems that are connected to it. And it was encouraging to hear that both recognize that. They didn't try to deflect, right?
No, they didn't. And to, as you mentioned, to Ferguson's credit, he launched it. He said, it's a complex problem. He said, mental health, dependency issues, affordability. Yeah, that's all part of it. But he didn't seem as willing as Reichert to basically say, if we do not address the drug crisis that we're facing, there is no chance we're going to make a dent in this homeless crisis. And I live in a part of Washington State, Federal Way, south of Seattle, where it's evident, every single day. And open drug use, nobody's doing anything to stop it. If we're going to allow that to happen and continue to do that, those people are going to remain on the streets because they'd rather be able to be an active drug user than even accept, housing or, even a low barrier shelter.
Right. California refers to those individuals as assistance resistant, service resistant.
Oh, that makes
homeless.
So much sense.
Where they say, no, they don't want to be placed. They don't want a home. One thing that stuck out, last thought on this, is Reichert's bold statement that if I am governor, I am vetoing any new tax. We are taxed enough in Washington. I wonder how well that's going to resonate because your total tax burden in Washington is one of the highest in the country. And it didn't. Did you really even notice that Ferguson didn't necessarily have an answer for that?
He didn't respond to it. Absolutely. And the moderators, unfortunately, didn't push back on that and expect an answer. And it'll be interesting to see if once Reichert, assuming he is elected, gets into office, he's able to hold true to that promise. It's one thing to make that campaign promise and a vastly different thing when you're up against lawmakers, even some with his own party and certainly moderates.
Right.
Wait. We need this big chunk of change to do this policy thing that you promised to do, i.e. hire a bunch more cops. How are you going to do all that?
Exactly. Force him to veto a bill that raises taxes to hire more police.
Yep.
Yeah. So thank you, Carlene. Great. It was a fascinating debate, and I'm definitely looking forward to the next one in your coverage. Moving on to Seattle, prostitution and human trafficking has resulted in increased violence in Seattle. City officials have been working on a response, but the community has pushed back on some of the proposals. Seattle reporter Spencer Pauly has chronicled the city council's hearings on the matter. Spencer, how bad has this issue become?
I think it's safe to say it's bad. The issue has gotten worse as years go on, especially in along Aurora Avenue in Seattle. In fact, I actually met someone pretty recently who lives on Aurora Avenue and frequents the streets, and he can attest that the streets are dangerous, with prostitution just being very prominent. Now, this legislation was sponsored by Kathy Moore, a first-time Seattle City Council member, and she said that prostitution correlates with gun violence and thus created this bill to address it, because she's shown videos in previous public hearings that shown prostitution within the same hour. You see gunfire and you see people fleeing the streets overnight. And this
and it's not just a couple shots, right? I mean, these are, I'd seen that video that they played. It was a gunfight. I mean, yes. OK Corral in the streets of Seattle. I was shocked.
And this isn't happening at, 2 a.m, 3 a.m. This is 10 p.m. to midnight.
It was daylight. It was, well, not that one was at night, but it was, there were people in the streets still.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, what was the original solution here that was proposed?
So the original solution includes a prohibition on loitering for the purpose of buying, selling, or pimping prostitution, with a separate provision that allows a judge to issue a stay out of area prostitution order that targets the northern Aurora Avenue area. And this bill would also restore the misdemeanor crime of prostitution loitering, which was removed in 2020 by the previous Seattle City Council regime. Yeah. This one was more progressive and saw punishing prostitutes as racist. And so that was going to be considered to be brought back to the table here.
So now, I mean, they're bringing back, an old policy like they have a couple times now. But what they got, the community response was really interesting to me with to say that, a lot of this becomes more punitive to the people who the community considers victims.
Yeah, feedback was very mixed during the one public hearing that was held last month. Residents along Aurora Avenue were the ones to say, hey, we need this legislation passed because we are tired of being victims of crime. Yeah. It's so dangerous. Where our friends and family are coming to visit us, and they're just feeling overall unsafe. But this is common in Seattle City Council meetings, where there are still people who do not like tough legislation that's tough on crime. Yeah. Some found that the bill targets prostitutes who are a victim of human trafficking, and said we need to instead prioritize rehabilitation instead of just punishing these people. And they say that this targets minorities, which is another issue that they found. And even in two cases I remember during the public hearing last month, there were some prostitutes who attended and said, hey, we choose to do this and we don't want to be targeted by police. So,
right. So the new approach now is to kind of go up the chain akin to with drug use. The target is the drug dealer and not the actual open air drug user. And this seems like a similar vein there.
Yeah. So Kathy Moore did listen to public hearing and did propose amendments that were passed that basically limit the stay out of area prostitution order to just buyers and pimps. And now Seattle Police Department officers are going to have to learn from sex trafficking survivor groups and prioritize diversion over arrest. This was what Kathy Moore proposed as a result of these comments. However, this legislation was passed on Tuesday, but it took a little bit. The committee meeting was a little rowdy, I would say. People were still in opposition to this based on the same things that were heard during public hearing. And so it's still not a bill that we're seeing total approval of from the community. But I think just hearing
but it's a compromise. I think it sounded like the city councilwoman was looking, she listened. And I mean, I guess in terms of responsive public service, I suppose that's, the best that you can get. Right.
That's exactly.
Thank you, Spencer. Appreciate it. Chronic absenteeism is classified as a student missing more than 10% of school days in a year. While some absences, a serious illness, for instance, can't be avoided, American children are missing more school than ever in the years after the COVID-19 pandemic. Capitol correspondent Carlene Johnson covered what Washington and more than a dozen other states are starting to take seriously. What's the pledge, Carlene?
Yeah, the pledge, Cole, from these 14 states, Washington being one of them, that have signed on, says that they will cut chronic student absenteeism by 50% by 2029. So in 5 years, the pledge is these states, and they're trying to get others to also sign the pledge, will cut that chronic absentee rate. And just for some context, chronic absenteeism, as defined by the U.S. Education Department, is missing 10% or more of school for any reason. That's whether your mom says we've got an appointment this morning or not. So excused or unexcused. So that's basically, it doubled from 1 out of 6 to almost 1 out of 3 students during the pandemic. And post-pandemic, there's been a very, very slight improvement, but not much.
Yeah, they're not below pre-pandemic levels yet.
Not anywhere close.
Now, the big thing, and you spoke with Hetty Chang, her organization, Attendance Works out of California, great organization, and they've been pushing for this for years, many years before the pandemic too. One thing that they note is that chronic absenteeism affects overall student progress, in terms of when the student is not there in the class learning, even if they're making up the homework. Testing and progress reports have shown that there's a marked drop in the students' learning if they cross that threshold into chronic absenteeism.
Right. Those academic progress reports, we've all seen them go, they started diving during COVID, right? And then we didn't, here in Washington State, at least we didn't do any measurement of student progress, state assessment tests and the like were all, set aside for a couple of years. But yeah, and you think about it too. I mean, it's obvious. So it's not just the student who's got the perfect attendance, but the teacher is going to be distracted and having to try to explain, missed instruction for a student who maybe wasn't there Monday, Tuesday, shows up on Wednesday, and maybe there's a pop quiz, and the teacher wants everybody to succeed. So she's going to spend an extra 10 minutes just with that kid or the few that weren't there. And then you get, I still have one at home that's in high school, and a lot of the class assignments are group projects or presentations, right? So then you got students that are grouped together, like a group of 3 or 4. If you've got 2 of the 4 that weren't there, half of the class time to prepare, ultimately the whole presentation is going to be tanked, and that's going to affect everybody in the group, even that kid with perfect attendance. So just a logical progression towards, academic decline based on, this high absentee rate.
Well, and you hit on a great point too, is that the squeaky wheel gets the attention, where teachers often say, 80% of my attention goes to 20% of the students in the class because they're either causing trouble, they're struggling, where the other students, they may need help, but they're not going to normally get that much, as much attention from the teacher as the ones that are in dire need of assistance. And with chronic absenteeism, you're piling on, where it becomes not just the students that are trouble students or the ones that regularly struggle. These students then who are missing the time are placed in that category, and that number grows to the detriment of the other students in the class.
It is, and you think about how it affects sort of mental health or divisions in the classroom, that kind of a thing, right? I mean, I remember being in school and the bad kid or the kid who needed the extra help getting all the attention. You might have a question for the teacher, and you don't get that class time because the teacher is, redirected to help the kids that are playing catch up. What you brought up, Attendance Works, who's done all this great work for a decade or more on this. One of the stats that they reported on when they announced this 14-state pledge was shocking to me. 29.7% of the nation's students, so just under 30% of students in American public schools, which is about 14.7 million kids, were chronically absent in the 21-22 school year. I mean,
right. Well, but at that same time, you have to think in 21-22, a lot of states were still remote. Much of California students were still attending over a computer, where it was very easy to just not log in for one reason or another.
Right.
So I think that, that's why a lot of those stats kind of just went out the window. But in terms of this pledge, Carlene, what are they doing about it now?
Yeah, initially it's just some sort of policy recommendations. They've got all these states to sign on. Washington Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, Chris Reichert, has signed on. They'd already been working on chronic absenteeism for the last few years. I've spoken to him about that a lot of times. But right now what they're doing is they're saying, okay, you states that have signed on, we're going to develop a box of resources for you. Some of it, I'm sure, is going to be legislative policy recommendations and the like, right? Go to your state leaders and policymakers, raise awareness, make sure everybody knows how bad this is, the dire nature of it, and then try to get resources to improve this. And the group will be meeting every 2 or 3 months, the leaders from these 14 states, to kind of go, okay, how's your progress? Let's help each other. What's working for you? What was a fail? And, try to really get on top of this, because I'm telling you, it is bad, since I still have one at home and in high school. And she tells me that, in a lot of her classes, about half the kids are gone on any given day. Right. It's not getting better.
My third grader's the same way. It's a really big problem. And I'm glad that states are really finally seeing the issue that this is going to cause, because it's going to affect them for the rest of their lives as well. Thank you, Carlene. In the long-running saga over a database meant to track when police have to use force on civilians, a new bit of drama has unfolded. Investigative reporter TJ Martinell wrote this week what the university tasked with making the database for public consumption might have at least attempted to step outside the letter of the law. First, TJ, could we have some background on the matter, because it's a little complex?
Yeah, so back in 2021, the state legislature passed a law that calls for the creation of a police use of force database that would be overseen by the state attorney general's office. And there was a bidding process in which Washington State University won the contract. It was the only bidder. And what has followed has been this very drawn out process of setting up this database. And the purpose of it is so that the public can access statistics and data on these incidents and be able to download it.
Okay. Now, what's the information that the university is seeking that's now become this, lightning rod of legality?
What they're trying to obtain is what's called computer-aided dispatch data. And this is what you would get from 911 call dispatch centers. And they're trying to get data user agreements with these dispatch centers in order to use that information for this database. And
people have raised red flags saying, hey, wait a minute.
Yeah, there's state law on criminal record privacy, and then there's also the FBI has a policy that regulates this kind of data. So, and if you violate those regulations with the FBI, you can lose access to their criminal justice databases. So that
which cripples a law enforcement organization, because they use that, they use that every day, hundreds of times a day, I imagine. And now your longtime source, Bob Scales, was one of the first ones to say, raise that red flag and say, hey, you understand what you're asking for is illegal, right?
Yeah, he reached out to the Washington State Emergency Management Division and said that could get them in huge legal trouble. They were actually going to discuss it, the data user agreement draft. There was a draft that was sent out. They were going to discuss it at their August 15th meeting, but it was canceled. The meeting wasn't canceled, but the plans to discuss it were canceled after they looked at this and just said, this is this contract, the data user agreement is at an individual dispatch center level. So let them deal with it, but also defer to your legal counsel on the matter.
And it wasn't just Scales saying, hey, you guys can't just get this whole hog.
Yeah. The Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs have also, they're neutral on the database itself. They have a very, neutrality perspective, but they've expressed concerns about whether or not this is going to run afoul of the FBI's Criminal Justice Information Service rules. And again, they also are telling their members to seek legal counsel and have them review it before doing anything. But they continue to say that they're worried about this database and what's going to be done with the information as far as whether or not it's going to violate the state or federal law.
Right. Now, what has WSU said? Wazoo.
Wazoo sent out to the Washington Association of Sheriff and Police Chiefs sent out a statement from the Attorney General's office saying that they're not seeking full access to an agency's CAD system. and which is not what anybody's arguing. They're not arguing. Nobody's arguing that they're trying to access the system. They're trying to access the data in the system. And the question is whether or not accessing that data, because Washington State University is not a criminal justice agency, it's a public university. And
subject to FOIA,
subject to public records requests. And in fact, I believe there's some people who've already tried to file public records requests to see if they can get this data, to see if it runs. If they do, they're not supposed to get that data. But because it's a public university, they're not subject to the same public records exemptions as a law enforcement agency.
Right. Now, what has the FBI said? You reached out to the FBI and said, hey, what's your take on this? You're the only one that hasn't said anything, and you're going to be the hammer that drops.
Right. They referred me to the CJIS Systems Agency with the Washington State Patrol, which has already issued a statement to Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs. And they effectively said that any data shared with Wazoo that contains CGI, it would be a compliance issue, and it's only authorized to be shared with another law enforcement agency or something like that. So that's where now, to be fair, that statement doesn't say that these data user agreements would be illegal. They're saying if it does this, then it has compliance issues.
Got it. All right. Well, we'll see what they do moving forward. Thank you, TJ, and a big thank you to our journalists for sharing their stories. Stay up to date with these and more at thecentersquare.com. I'm Cole Lauterbach, and until next time, this has been Washington in Focus.